Quinn Aboudara. As Jennifer said, I am the resident blacksmith with Beaver Brothers Trading Company and a knife maker. And I've been making knives now for about 4 or 5 years actively, but I've been sharpening my knives for over 30 years now. I grew up on Prince of Wales Island, and my family is very focused on subsistence and traditional food gathering and processing. So we use knives a lot. We use fillet knives, kitchen knives, hunting knives, you know, the whole gamut. And, you know, as was mentioned earlier, a sharp knife definitely makes your job easier and safer. So today's period of instruction, which thank you all for joining us today, it'll be mostly about how to sharpen a knife. This is the technique that I have learned and that I use as a blacksmith and a knife maker and for my own knives at home. You can go on YouTube and the internet and watch other videos, and you'll find other people have different techniques. And without saying too much disparaging, I find that there's often flaws in those techniques. And I mainly blame Hollywood for this. So if you've watched Rambo sharpen his knife, you've probably watched him do it wrong. But that's how it's often portrayed. Anyways, so a few things that we have today, equipment wise, and this might be a moment, Jennifer, to highlight the top view camera. Okay, awesome. Okay, so some things that we have today, a couple of knives, right? Here I've got a fillet knife, a fillet style knife here, a kitchen style knife, and then my hunting knife. We also have our whetstone. This is a Japanese water stone that I use. This is an old one, so it's not top quality. I've also got one of these like basters. These are great if you're using a water stone. And then a glass of water here to keep this stone wet. And then I was also asked to demonstrate some alternative knife sharpening materials. So I've got a trusty ceramic mug, okay? And I'll show that here in a few. And these are your general tools here. And hopefully my hands aren't going too fast for everybody's connection because it seems kind of jumpy for me. So let's talk about those tools. The first one is the most obvious one that we're going to be using as this is a knife sharpening class is your whetstone. Now, some people like to think that whetstone means that it has to be wet, and that's partially true. But wet, W-H-E-T, actually means sharpening. To wet a knife is to sharpen it. So that's when they talk about a sharpening stone and call it a whetstone, that's all same thing. There's two different types of whetstones that most people are familiar with. The first is what's considered an oil stone, which I have several around here, but that's not what we're using today. The other is a water stone, which tends to have a finer grain. So it kind of puts a finer edge on your knife. Good whetstones come in a variety of different grits, typically starting at about 200 and working up to, I think this is a 6,000. Yeah, this is a 6,000 grit on the white side. Most of your sharpening stones, your whetstones, will be two-sided. You can't really see on this one because it's pretty old, but there's a blue side here, and that's my coarser grit. And then there's a white one here, and that's my fine grit. This will be my finishing side. This is an old stone, so it has quite a bit of a sway in the middle, as you can see here. But it's still functional. I mean, it's still got quite a bit of life in it. Anyway, so that's, whetstones. If you're using a whetstone, a water stone like this, you want to soak it, pre-soak it before you start working on the whetstone. Typically about 10 to 15 minutes or until all the gases escape. And you'll also, with a water stone, want to keep a handy supply of water and something to apply it with. Some people just, dip your fingers in and apply a bit. But what that does is it'll lift the metal grain that you're taking off of your knife. It'll lift that up and it'll slough it off to the sides. You can see like there's a powder in my tray here. That's all old whetstone and knife material. And that's pretty much it. If anyone has any questions, please. I actually work better with questions because I might have missed something. Where do I buy my whetstones and what are the whetstones made out of? Great question, Pauline. So I actually order mine off of Amazon, but you can usually find them in hardware stores or any sort of like fishing supply store, sporting goods. And your whetstones can be made out of all different kinds of things. These water stones are very fine clay. And most whetstones are a bit more coarse. They might be made out of like, it's slipping my aluminum oxide. So they come in all different kinds of materials. You can get diamond stones, at different grits. So yeah, all sorts of different materials. Good question though. And most of them you'll be able to find on like, what material would I recommend? I really like these water stones, and let me see, give me 1 second and I can tell you what brand I use. If I can find it. Okay, sorry, I wasn't prepared for that, but I don't know if everybody can read that, but the AHNR knife sharpening stone set. This is a great set. It's not the one that I'm using today, but it's a great set. This comes with a wooden base, which is nice, and two separate water stones of different, see, different grit. So this one's a 400 to 1000, and the other one is more of a finishing stone, like what I'm using today. But this is, I think this runs me about $30 on Amazon. Pretty inexpensive, but I've enjoyed using them for a while now. Does that answer your question? Okay. Well, great. Any more questions before we move on? How long can I use them? So each stone's going to be a little bit different. It's going to depend a lot on like how you're using it, how often you're using it, whether it's a water stone or a oil stone, which is something I should mention. If you are using an oil stone, it can only be oil. And I usually use like just regular vegetable oil on my oil stones. With a water stone, only water. So pick one or the other and go from there. You can use two different stones, one water, one oil, but remember which one. So how long can you use them? I have used this stone for about 2 years now, and it's about time to replace it. It's a very well used stone, especially during the summer. But most, like if you're just sharpening a couple of kitchen knives every now and then, once a month or even once a week, your whetstone is going to last quite a while. Yeah. So. All right. Great. I think we still have some time for some more questions if anybody wants. If anyone has any more questions. And if there are no more questions, we can kind of continue on with the next part of this, which would be the demonstration as best as I can. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, so we will go into demonstration. So, in general, it doesn't really matter what shape of the knife is. We'll talk about some knife anatomy real quick, okay? So obviously handle, right? This part here is the spine, and then the cutting part, the blade, is frequently called the blade or the belly of the knife as well. And it's important, as I try to explain, and fortunately we do have the video here, so hopefully you'll be able to see that I am going to be going with the spine, right? The spine towards me and the blade down. And you might see me flip it the other way. So be watching where the spine is. A lot of people end up going the opposite direction, if that makes sense. When I'm in person and I'm showing somebody how to sharpen a knife, what I explain to them is think about the motion that dulled your knife, right? You were cutting. So you were, slicing through something. You were, cutting something, and eventually that dulls your knife. So what we're going to do is the opposite of that. Basically, we are going to slowly draw the knife over your whetstone, and we're going to push or pull the metal from the upper part of your knife towards this way. And you'll eventually get a burr, which is like a thin metal wire. And that's what you're wanting. You're wanting that burr. And I'll explain why as we go. But basically behind that burr, it is super, super, super thin. Almost, I mean, if you go high enough grit, it will be almost like microscopically thin. And then eventually you'll break that burr off, and then you'll have a sharp knife. So I usually use about a 20-degree angle. Some people like a little steeper of an angle, or, but usually you don't go a whole lot shallower. Like if you go too shallow, all you're going to do is sharpen the side of your knife. And that's not where we're wanting to hit. One trick that I learned is to take a Sharpie marker, and you can actually mark the edge, of your knife. And when the black goes away, you're hitting the right spots. So anyways, okay, so we'll show this. I'm using actually a fairly sharp knife. This is a high carbon steel knife, so it kind of looks dull, and maybe a little bit rusty. I'm not sure how well it's showing up in the video, but I did that intentionally so that we would be able to see the action as we go. So I'm going to just put some water on here. And what I do is I go down to pretty much the furthest, as close to the handle as I can get it. I have that 20-degree angle, and I'll put my fingers along. How do I establish the angle? So for me, I've got quite the practiced eye. But the other way that you can tell is typically, and it'll be really difficult to show on the camera, but typically you'll see the bevel right here. And there'll be kind of a separation. So if you sighted down your knife like this, you should be able to see another angle. Your knife will come down and then kind of angle. That's usually the angle that you want. If you're using a store-bought knife, they can have some different angles. Store-bought knives will eventually lose a large amount of that angle as you sharpen them, because it was a factory established angle. All of my knives, these are hand forged that I'm using today. They're all high carbon steel, and I make my own angles on them, and I actually use a fairly flat angle. So the other way is, again, with most of your knife sharpening sets, it will have a guide. That's the other thing, is it'll have something like this. Again, I don't use a guide, but it's a good thing to have. I mean, this one's still in the plastic. It's a good thing to have if you're just starting out. And let me see if I can actually open this. Great question though, Nathan. That I appreciate that. So it's basically just like a triangular looking piece. You slide it on to the spine of your knife like so, and that you can kind of rest that angle on there. You see that? Great. See, and that'll establish that angle. And once you get used to it, once you get your hands used to the motions, usually you'll find your own angle and you can play with that from there. Some people like a slightly shallower angle, maybe because they're using their knife like in the kitchen and they're wanting to slice, meats and vegetables. Whereas with your hunting knife, you're probably going to want a bit more of a deeper angle, because you're probably skinning out an animal, processing animals. You're cutting through a little bit more stuff that could the angle will give you a little bit more resilience to your knife. So a tighter angle, a shallower angle is really good for slicing through, like a steak or a tomato. Whereas our fish cutting knives angle's different, like a fillet knife. Fillet knives, you typically want a pretty shallow angle. Again, and that's because of, as you're cutting through fish, you're going to be hitting some bone, rib bones, spinal bone, spinal cord, tail bones. But ultimately, those bones are pretty soft. I will say you will have to sharpen your knives more if you're using a fillet knife. Fillet knives dull out very quickly because you're hitting all of those bones, even though they're small. Your kitchen knives, depending on how much you use them, will also dull actually faster than your hunting knife for the most part. Your hunting knives will typically get nicks and chips in the blade versus like this here. When your knife dulls, for the most part, it's because the cutting edge is actually rounding over. And so that's what we're doing, is taking that edge and sharpening it. Any other questions about angles? Okay. So again, I'm hoping that kind of the rustiness of this knife will be able to show as I'm sharpening it, and you'll be able to watch my hands and the motions that I make. And I'll try to kind of walk through my process as I go. So again, I establish my angle, right? We have our knife pretty much up to the last bit of edge of the blade. And I've got my angle set. And then I just start by kind of doing a slow draw back towards the tip, down the length of the whetstone. And it's kind of like that. And I'm applying pressure towards the blade, not towards the spine. Okay, let's see if my plan had worked. Okay, so yeah, see there we are. You can start to see how that edge is starting to get shiny. This would work also if I put, you know, some black marker on there. But it's going to take quite a bit more to get that all shiny. So we'll keep going. Another thing to mention is to try to keep in your head a count of how many passes you do on each side. So if I do, because you want to keep that knife, the blade even. You want the same passes on your right hand side as you do on your left hand side. And depending on which hand you're dominant, I'm predominantly right-handed, you'll end up probably getting a bias towards that hand. That's natural. It's kind of difficult to not get that bias in there if you're hand sharpening. It just has to do with the way that your hands and your arms move and where you apply pressure. So anyways, we'll get this going. But you can see, hopefully, that I'm keeping that angle and I'm applying pressure evenly across that blade. So that blade is pushing into the sharpening stone. So 6 passes on that side means 6 passes on this side. And this is where your bias comes in. Okay. Well, we're doing pretty good there. Got pretty even. And then depending on how dull your knife is, you might have to, repeat. If you've got a big chip in there or something, this could take, a good chip, you're probably going to have to sit down with a flat file and actually take out that chip before you take it to your whetstone. Again, there are whetstones that have a lower grit, which means that the grain size of the whetstone itself is larger. I forget what it is. I think it's like per inch. So this is a 1,000 grit per inch. There's 1,000 little pieces of material in there so it's pretty fine. Whereas a 400 grit, there's only 400 inches or 400 pieces of material in that inch. And that makes it a coarser stone. It'll make most of your knife sharpening. That's what I'll usually start a hunting knife with, is about 800 grit, depending on how much I've used it and when the last time I sharpened it was. I keep my knives pretty sharp, so usually this is more than adequate for myself. Are there any questions at this point while I'm going through this? Is there something that you want me to talk about or to highlight as I'm going? How often do I need to put the water on the stone? Yeah, so I don't know how well you can see, but up here, this area is starting to get dry, but if I run my finger over it, I can still see moisture. Down here, there's a substantial amount of moisture still. So what I'll do is I'll use it until basically I don't see it pooling up down at this end of the stone, because that's what's happening is when I draw my knife, it is pulling the water out of the stone and will transfer it down this way. So once I stop seeing water up in this area, I know it's dry. Put another squeeze of water on there, kind of flush away any of the knife material, any metal shavings that have deposited up there. So maybe you can see that water. I don't know. Okay. That's also why, like, you'll see a lot of people with water stones. They'll also have some sort of tray. This is just like a Pyrex dish lid. Works great. It catches the water. You can just dump it. You don't have to worry about it spilling all over your clothes, etc. I used to use some of the stands that they come with, but I found that those just get water everywhere. And most water stones are a little bit different. Each one's a little bit different. So some will run a little bit drier sooner than others. Oil stones, you'll have to use less oil, but as you use your stone, you kind of get familiar with it, and you'll see when the knife material is lifting off of your stone and when it's not. And once it starts building up on your stone, you'll get a black mark or some sort of mark like that, where it's actually embedded into the stone. And you don't want that. Like, that was my bad there moment. But that one's actually not so bad. You can also get a stone flattener, which is another stone that you face. You shave down the face of the wet stone itself, and that'll clean that out. So again, this is an old stone, so I use it mostly for, like, when we're processing fish and stuff at the smokehouse. So it's probably gotten some oils on it and stuff, and that's why that's there. And the other side is even worse. So. Okay. So we're getting pretty good here. I don't know how well that shows up. Oh, yeah. Okay, so we can see I've still got a little bit of roughness there, but up right above it, it's really nice and shiny and clean. Can everybody see that? the difference there? And then here at the tip, it's still kind of got some gunk on there. So we'll have to work on the tip a little bit. Great, great. Good. Yeah, see that? Just a little bit, not too bad. So again, we were talking about, I'm predominantly right-handed, and we can see for the most part, the left side of my knife has been clean. You know, it's getting a cleaner edge than the right side of my knife. And that's pretty normal. And that's where, you know, we really try to keep even number of passes on your stone. You try to maintain that pressure and the, you know, even pressure across the length of your knife. Some people you'll see will do more like kind of, their hands will almost cover the knife, and that's fine. For me, it just seems easier to kind of evenly space my fingers across. But there really isn't a wrong way of holding the knife as long as you have that pressure against the blade to keep it firm and in place. And it helps to move stuff out of your way, especially with a longer knife. You get your hands and you can kind of slap into stuff if you're not careful. And that's why I usually do it on a pretty open space, like my kitchen counter or the fish table or something like that. Okay, so you probably can't see it on the camera, but I can see it here on my whetstone, and I'll try to get it off of here so that you can all see it. But in the process of this, I ended up getting a small burr, and yep, nope, it's gone. But there was a small burr of metal that has come off of the knife, and that's normal. But when you're using your water stone, keep your eyes on the stone and watch for it'll look like a little itty bitty hair on your stone, and that's actually a burr of metal. So the easiest way is to very gently like take it off with your finger, or you can use even the edge of your knife to kind of pick it off, rinse it off, you know, get rid of it. Take a paper towel, you know, but those burrs will end up scratching into your whetstone and marring the surface, and it just doesn't, you know, going back to how long can you use a whetstone depends on how well you take care of it and how often you remove those burrs from it before they embed into your whetstone. Okay. So again, bring it up. We can see that for the most part, there's a little bit here, but that's at the back of the knife. And usually a lot of people end up losing that. On some of my knives, I'll actually just take a file and flatten it out there. So that's a part that I don't have to sharpen, because I know that it's gonna probably be missed while it's in the sharpening. But we can see kind of that it's pretty clean. Still a little bit up here on the tip. You can see that. Again, still a little bit up on the tip on there. But for the most part, it's pretty clean. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about this process at this point? Okay. So then the next step, if you have a two-part stone, you know, is you're going to flip it over to your next higher grit. This is the grit that I'm using right here is 6,000 grits. So 6,000 pieces of material, you know, per inch. And this is the finishing grit. Most people aren't going to take their knives to 6,000, but as a knife maker and a blacksmith and somebody who uses their knives a lot, it's kind of nice to have that finished edge. Not necessary though. Most people can stop at about 800 grit, maybe 1,000 for finishing. But like I said, this is kind of where you start getting into that mirrored finish. This stone has quite the sway in it because it's an old stone. What was the grit on the first side? The grit on this one, the blue side, was 1,000. So I started at what most people would finish at. And that's because I keep my knives really sharp all the time. It was actually kind of difficult for me to find some knives that weren't fully sharpened for this demonstration. So, but the 6,000, that's my finishing grit. And so I'll start off, because it was, you know, face down and in this kind of mucky water and stuff. I'll just rinse it real quick. You know, again, these little nose dropper things, you can pick them up at a grocery store or pharmacy. They're usually like, I don't know, I think like $2. But this thing has been awesome to use. Your fingers don't get all pruny, wet and pruny that way. But we'll toss some water on there. And then it's the same motions. You know, we're going to start again at the as close to the handle, you know, to the cut, so that we can get the most of the cutting edge. And I don't know if I mentioned this earlier. So one thing for me that keeps me even on how many passes I make on each side, I do it in intervals of 3. So like if I do 3 passes on one side and swap it, then I stay at 3 per side. Or like 6, 9, you know, for whatever reason, 3 works for me. Some people might want to do like intervals of 4 or 8 or whatever you're comfortable with. As long as you're keeping an even number of passes on each side. So one thing you may notice is, again, this is a water stone, and this is a very, very high grit water stone right now. And you'll see this discoloration here. Again, that is actually metal from your knife transferring onto your whetstone. So when you start to see that build up, it's time to clean it. You can see how it kind of turns gray. So I'll just kind of squirt some of that down. Use my fingers to kind of wipe it off. Boom. Again. All right. So it's a little bit difficult to see, but you can kind of see right here, there's like a brighter patch, and then it looks almost like a duller patch right beneath it. That duller patch is actually some of the material, some of the residue from your whetstone and from the knife. But that's also a good indicator of where it's marking, or where the blade is actually hitting on your whetstone. Again, this is an old whetstone. It's got quite the dip, but it's actually hitting pretty evenly throughout it. I could probably make my angle a little bit more shallow to hit up in like this area up in here. See that? You can still see some of that. This is a good part to have something to wipe your knife on, like a paper towel or a hand towel, or in my case, like just my jacket. I'm not too worried about it. I usually have like a pair of Carhartt pants on. I'll wipe it on my pant leg. I have knife dust everywhere. Cannot travel through TSA because it, rings all the bells. So again, I'll, clean off my stone. With an oil stone, you don't have to do that as much usually. So like a lot of people like oil stones because they're kind of less maintenance. And I suppose that's true. The thing is most people end up using water on their whetstone, on their oil stone. So, okay, so we can barely see it here. Let me see if I can actually bring it up. Okay, let me see if I can. So right there, there's a little, it looks like a little hair on the whetstone, and that is a very, very, very fine metal shaving. And that's what you do not want embedding into your whetstone. So when we see those, we rinse them off. And you'll start to see them more when you're starting to finish. Because again, what we're doing is, as you're going, right, your knife A dull knife is kind of like this, right? It's kind of rounded. They'll have just a little bit of a cutting edge, and that's why you can still cut things, but for the most part, it's rounded. As you sharpen it, if I'm sharpening on this side, what I'm doing is I'm actually drawing out that bottom edge. Yeah. I'm drawing out that bottom edge, and then I flip it over and I draw out this edge. And as I do that, my angle gets shallower. It gets sharper, right? It goes from this out like that. But what happens is usually you'll get a little burr, a little tag of, a little hair of metal that can't quite break away from that very fine edge that you have now. Your finishing stone, a honing stone, or a stropping leather will take those burrs off. Any questions about any of that? And how do you know when you just need to hone versus need the sharpening stone? Great question. Me personally, I always go to the sharpening stone instead of the honing stone. I don't have a honing stone, but you'll see them often in TV. It looks like a stick with a handle on it, and you see, somebody going up and down it. That's a honing stone. You can use, so most chefs, most people who work in kitchens on daily basis that are not cutting through like a lot of bone and stuff like that, they will hone their knife every time they go into the kitchen. And usually they will have like a honing stick handy, and will actually hone their knives between, like, say you're cutting pork and then you clean your knife and then you go to cut tomatoes. You're going to hone it. You're going to cut up your pork, wash your knife, get it nice and clean, hone it, and then cut your tomatoes. For the average user, if you have a honing stick, they're really great tools to have. It'll save you a lot of time at the sharpening stone for the most part. But I would say for the most part, you could probably hone your knives about once a week. Take a couple quick minutes. I kind of wish that I had a honing stone right now so that I could show that process, but it's basically the same thing. You see people holding a stick, your honing stone, and you'll see them often like running it down this way and then this way. It's, again, your spine, and you're actually going to do this motion, like almost a flicking motion, and then do it on the other side. And again, that's because you got a burr there and you want to remove that burr by taking it up. I guess you could also, come down this way as well. It all kind of depends on what you're comfortable with. But you're wanting to remove that burr because your sharp edge is behind that burr. So hopefully that answered your question. And Jennifer, please feel free to give me like a time buzzer or something, like if we're going long and we have question and answers and stuff like that as well going on. So
Sounds good. We have another question from Nathan. My older knives all have their tips gently rounded off. How to fix?
okay, yeah, gently rounded off. So older knives, gently rounded tips actually tend to happen quite a bit. You can actually kind of see on this one, mine is kind of started to round out as well. Let me try to get that in the camera. Maybe. I don't know. Okay. Right there. Yeah. See how it's starting to round up? Most of that is actually from your process of coming across, and what you end up doing is sliding your knife this way, and it's pulling that metal this way. Quick fix, take a flat file, put it in a vise, or hold it somehow so that it's nice and level, and just take your flat file and push it, like so. Just take off that edge and sharpen it up. If you have a knife like mine, that'll work. Sometimes it doesn't work, especially like for fillet knives, right? You want that nice, crisp, sharp edge. And this is, again, where, like, if this edge started to round out, what I would probably do would be take it to like a 400 grit. I'd probably start with a file and then go 400 grit, and I would just really focus on that tip and drawing it out evenly so that I am only pushing that one spot, and this is one a few times, like you'll see every now and then, I'll go like this, and I'm just I'm just focusing on that tip, making sure that I'm not rounding it out. But yeah, that's a great question, Nathan. Thank you. Is there any other questions or, any, does anybody want me to show them something a little bit more, like specifically? Serrated knives, yeah, no, they are not. For a serrated knife, you'll need a steak knife, or some pocket knives have serrations. You'll need a round file, which I've got a couple around here somewhere, but not handy. But you'll want to, again, so what I do is I will brace the knife like so, and then I will take that round file and carefully go down each serration in the direction from spine to blade, right? So going that way, like so, kind of, we're imagining my finger. This is our notional round file. And then you go along, flip over, With a serrated blade, you can just pick up pretty much any round file from like your hardware store, or like here in Craig, we have Tyler Rental that specializes in like chainsaw files and stuff, you know. Any of those will work really well. And then from there, you can actually go and get special sharpening kits that are designed with a small, and I might have one handy here. Yeah. Okay. So it'll have like a small stick file like this. This has actually got a diamond grit in it. So this would work really well for most. In fact, I'll grab a steak knife. Maybe not that one. Maybe not any of these. Okay, here we go. Okay, sorry. Okay, so this is a old Victorinox, and it's got a serrated edge. Hopefully we can see that. There we go. There we go. Okay, Victorinox, it's got a serrated edge. This is a very, very dull Victorinox. I never use it, so I'm only using this for demonstration. So again, you'll have a round file, and you just keep that angle. You keep the angle of the serration itself, and you just go in the groove. And serrated knives can be very time consuming, especially if it's as dull as this one. I mean, this one's very dull. But that's basically it. You might be able to see, yeah. Okay, so see, there's the angle right in there. And you just keep your file right in there. And maintain the angle of the serration. It's going to be really difficult to see on this one. Couple of reasons. This is a Victorinox knife. Really great boat knives if you use them. They tend to keep their edges really well, but they are stainless steel. And stainless steel is a lot more difficult to sharpen. Whereas the knives that I use, you know, that I make, they're high carbon steel and they are tempered. So they are actually with the intention of making it easier for myself or the other user, you know, it makes it easier for them to sharpen. Hopefully that answers your question, Pauline, in a very roundabout way. I also want to thank everybody. This is my first Zoom period of instruction. So please let me know if I'm missing anything as we go. Is it recommended to use high carbon steel blades instead of stainless steel? That is a can of worms that many people find contentious. No, it's high carbon steel blades are generally considered softer than stainless steel. So it's really a matter of preference. For me, I prefer the carbon steel knives because they'll get a really sharp edge. They'll be very, very sharp, but they will dull slightly faster. Whereas stainless steel tends to be more rigid. It's more brittle. And it will retain an edge for a longer period of time. However, it will take substantially more work when you do dull it. Stainless steel knives are time consuming to sharpen by hand. And I'll usually throw them on my belt sander. But people like stainless steel, and it's typically what you're going to find, you know, if you go to your sporting goods store or buy like a knife set through catalog or online, unless they specifically say it's high carbon steel. Well, I use a belt sander. I actually have a professional belt sander in my shop that's designed for sharpening knives. You don't want to go into your tool shed and grab the manual, belt sander and go to town. It just makes it faster for me if I'm sharpening a stainless steel knife. But I still will finish it by hand on whetstone. The other issue that I have with stainless steel knives when you use them on a whetstone is you tend to get more of those burrs, right? The fine hair-like strings of metal coming off of your knife, off the blade. So you have to do more stone maintenance as well. Not a problem. Good question, though. A lot of people don't, a lot of people will go to like a sporting goods store and get a knife, and it's stainless steel, and it will, get dull, and they'll attempt to sharpen it by themselves, and they'll get frustrated because they're like, it just does not get an edge. It does. You just really have to work for it, and you have to apply that constant pressure, which is something that, I can only kind of demonstrate of where I put my fingers and talk about, but it's something that you as the knife sharpener will have to find. But it's a good, it's a decent amount of pressure.
This is really great, Quinn. Yeah, I'm really just fascinated. Like, it seems like all our questions lead to more questions. And this has been really awesome. I wonder if we don't have any more questions, and certainly please feel free to put more questions in the chat. But if we want to switch over to our alternative sharpening tools, it might be a good time, since I think you've demonstrated on all of your blades, if we want to move over to the ceramic cup, and then if we have other questions, I have other questions about alternative sharpeners too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So our other alternative, so the alternative that I have for everybody today is nothing more than a ceramic mug, coffee mug. Now, growing up, my grandfather always had coffee mugs, and his always had kind of a tilt to it. Never could figure it out until I watched him one day sharpen his knife. And this actually, if you don't have a honing stick, the bottom of a ceramic cup will work great. But that's what he was doing, was sharpening his knife on the bottom of his coffee cup. And so all of his coffee cups had a little bit of a tilt. And it's the same thing. You know, you see this darker ring here. This is the exposed ceramic from, you know, pottery ceramic, where when you fire it, you have to have a dry spot. You have to have an exposed spot, you know, otherwise the enamel, the glaze will melt and stick to your kiln and stuff. So they tell me. I'm not much of a potter, so just going on what everybody else says there. But this is another great, you know, alternative. Most people have some sort of coffee mugs, bowls, you know, but you just kind of, same thing. And you can see, like, I'm just kind of using half of my mug here, but you can see, maybe you can see, there's some residue starting to develop along here, you know, so that's what you want to see. And again, you know, you keep your strokes even, numbered. It's a little bit of a different motion. You might be able to see that on there. It's kind of a, I'm drawing it down the entire length of the blade. If you have a mug that's entire, this section is actually all flat, that's a great sharpening surface. This is also another good way to do the tips, Nathan, so that you get that nice crisp. You just have to focus right there. You know, kind of work it like that. We can see starting to take that off. So well, thank you, Nathan. Thank you for coming. And yeah. Yeah, and other alternative sharpening materials, you know, if you find a smooth rock, most rocks are actually going to be pretty good. People ask me, like, how can I tell that the rock is good to sharpen a knife? And I basically tell them, if you cannot see the grain, like you can't you know, sandstone will work really well. Limestone, somewhat. If you can find a really nice piece of flat limestone, it'll work. You generally will have to like find another rock and smooth down the face of it a bit. But rocks work great. I mean, they worked for thousands and thousands of years before we came up with the technology and wherewithal to do a two-sided whetstone like this. Again, the larger grain that you have in the rock, the lower the grit will be, and the coarser that rock will be. Typically, I can tell you whether, you know, if it's coarse, medium, or fine just by looking at it. Also, ceramic tiles work great. You know, if you've tiled a floor or wall or something like that, you can find the ceramic tile. You flip it over, you'll find something like this that works awesome. And it's a pretty cheap sharpening stone. See, what other things have I used? Yeah, that's about it. And then of course files. Most of the files that you're going to find, unless you order them specifically for knife sharpening, they're only going to be like coarse and medium grade. You're not going to find many fine files unless they're specifically for knife sharpening. And those you can pick up usually at a hardware store or even the grocery store. And when you do look for your files, make sure that they are for metal. There are wooden rasp type files as well. And I've seen people try to sharpen knives with wood rasps, and it doesn't end well for anyone. So, any other questions? Or are we at that time to go into the breakouts there?
Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, you can share those, or if you're interested in doing or like if you happen to have something to sharpen and you want Quinn to tutor, mentor, I can stop the recording and we could do that. Any preferences?
I'm going to actually have to run, but thank you for the great techniques. I'm totally going to put them to use.
Great.
Oh, but actually, right before I leave, I got to show you this weird thing, because I just realized I'm sitting here in this room.